You hear the scream before you see her. A woman's voice cutting through the winter air somewhere along the muddy road between Brasov and the Danube, where the cart tracks disappear into frozen earth. Then you see them bodies arranged in a deliberate line, stakes driven through torsos, faces frozen in expressions that death couldn't erase. But these aren't soldiers. The clothing tells you that. The jewelry scattered in the mud tells you that. And the horror on the faces of the Ottoman scouts who just rounded the hill tells you that Vlad Gapik has crossed a line that even war doesn't usually cross. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. It amazes me that a story this dark, from a winter nearly 6 centuries ago, still reaches people across the entire world. This is Wallachia, winter of 1462. The Ottoman Empire. The most powerful military machine on earth is pushing into the Danubian frontier. Mehmed II, the man who conquered Constantinople, has sent foraging parties north to secure supply routes. And Vlad Dracula, ruling a principality barely 1/10 the size of the Ottoman war machine, has decided that if he cannot win through numbers, he will win through nightmare. The Venetian dispatches from March of that year describe something the diplomats struggled to put into words. Genoese merchants traveling the Bran Road wrote letters home that month mentioning columns of the impaled near crossroads. But the detail that appears again and again in Greek chronicles, Saxon town records, and even Ottoman military reports is this: among the bodies on the stakes were women captured during raids, taken from border towns, and displayed as a message that transcended the usual rules of medieval warfare. The question isn't whether it happened. The archaeological record mass graves near Targovik, osteological evidence of perimortem trauma, scattered domestic items found at roadside execution sites confirms what the chronicles describe. The question is why? What calculation? What strategic logic could lead a Christian ruler to impale captured Ottoman women and leave them where enemy supply columns would find them? The answer lies in understanding just how desperate Vlad's position truly was. By late 1461, the Ottoman advance had become a slow strangulation. Foraging parties stripped the countryside. Towns that resisted were burned. Civilian populations were being relocated into Ottoman territories to deny Wallachia its tax base and labor force. Hungarian allies were hesitating. The Papal coalition that had promised support was tangled in Italian politics. Vlad ruled a principality being consumed from the edges inward, and he knew that conventional resistance would mean conventional defeat. So he made a choice that chroniclers would debate for centuries. The winter raids began as guerrilla tactics, small, mobile units striking Ottoman detachments in the forests south of the Danube. Tursenbeg's chronicle, written from the Ottoman perspective, describes these raids with a note of frustration. The Wallachian forces would appear, strike, and vanish before reinforcements could respond. But it's the aftermath of these raids that reveals Vlad's actual strategy. The captured Ottomans weren't held for ransom. They weren't imprisoned. They were impaled on, not quickly. The process, as described in multiple contemporary sources, involved a carefully shaped stake inserted vertically, designed to avoid major organs so death would take hours, sometimes days. And then the bodies were arranged along roads, at crossroads, near water sources, anywhere Ottoman scouts and supply trains would see them. The immediate effect was logistical. Ottoman commanders began reporting supply shortages. Foragers became reluctant to enter Wallachian forests. Routes had to be changed, timetables adjusted. In the calculus of medieval warfare, fear became a force multiplier. Vlad's brutality was doing what his limited army could not. But then the strategy escalated. A cluster of sources from early 1462 Venetian dispatches, Hungarian military letters, a captured Ottoman memorandum preserved in the Transylvanian archives describe raids on civilian targets, villages suspected of collaboration, market towns near the border. And this is where women enter the narrative not as collateral damage, but as deliberate targets. The Brasov Council book from March 1462 records an incident that multiple other sources corroborate. A Wallachian raid on an Ottoman supply depot captured not just soldiers, but camp followers, merchants' wives, women who traveled with the supply trains. According to the council record, these women were brought to Targovect. Some were executed in the town square as collaborators. Others were impaled on the road leading south, positioned where they would be found by the next Ottoman column. The Venetian merchant diaries from this period describe the atmosphere in the frontier towns. Markets closing early, families hiding valuables, women, in particular, living in terror of being caught in the raids that swept back and forth across the border. Because the precedent had been set, women were no longer protected by the informal rules that usually governed medieval warfare. They had become instruments in Vlad's psychological strategy. And the most disturbing part? It worked. Ottoman military reports from spring 1462 show the strategic impact. Commanders were requesting additional guards for supply convoys. The fiscal registers show increased allocations for security. Routes that had been reliable for decades were being abandoned. The cost of maintaining the advance into Wallachia was rising with every stake, every display, every horror that greeted foraging parties when they pushed too far north. But there was a consequence Vlad may not have fully anticipated: the international reaction. When news of the impaled women reached the courts of Europe, carried by merchants, diplomats, refugees, the response was visceral. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, Vlad's nominal ally, received letters from Saxon burghers demanding intervention. Papal legates wrote with barely concealed disgust. Even some of Vlad's own nobles began questioning whether the defense of Wallachia justified what was being done in its name. The paradox was brutal. The tactics that were saving Wallachia militarily were destroying Vlad politically. And then came the event that chroniclers would remember for centuries: the night attack on Mehmed II's camp in June 1462. Vlad, with perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 men, launched a raid directly on the Sultan's encampment. The attack failed to kill Mehmed, but the psychological impact was exactly what Vlad intended. The Sultan, the conqueror of Constantinople, had been attacked in his own camp by a vastly outnumbered enemy. But it was the morning after that raid which produced the image that would define Vlad's legacy. When Mehmed's army advanced the next day, They came upon a field outside Targovik that Ottoman chroniclers called the Forest of the Impaled. 20,000 stakes, according to Turzenbeg's account. Bodies in various stages of decay. And prominently displayed, among them deliberately positioned where they couldn't be missed, were women. Captured Ottoman women. Camp followers. Civilians from the raided territories. Mehmed II, the Sultan who had seen the slaughter of Constantinople, reportedly turned his horse around. According to multiple sources, he said words to the effect that he could not compete with a man who used such methods. Within weeks, the Ottoman army withdrew from Wallachia. Vlad had won. Through a strategy so brutal that even his enemies chose retreat over facing what he was willing to do. But the victory was temporary and hollow. Within months, King Matthias citing Vlad's atrocities. Using letters that described the impaled women as evidence, arrested Vlad and imprisoned him. The political cost of the psychological warfare had come due. Vlad would spend 12 years in a Hungarian prison, his principality handed to a more manageable ruler, his reputation transformed from defender into monster. The women whose bodies became instruments of his strategy left traces in the archaeological record, personal items found at execution sites, osteological evidence of trauma, entries in ransom ledgers where families tried desperately to buy back daughters and sisters before it was too late. They exist in parish registers listing the missing, in notarial documents recording the financial ruin of families who paid ransoms, in the collective memory of frontier communities that would whisper these stories for generations. The full accounting of how many women died this way is lost to time. The chronicles offer numbers that range from dozens to hundreds, but medieval sources rarely counted women with precision. What remains is the structural evidence. This wasn't random brutality, was policy. Deliberate, calculated. Designed to break not just Ottoman military will, but the psychological fabric that held their supply lines together. And it reveals something darker than individual cruelty. It shows how warfare, when pushed to its extremes, transforms humans into instruments. How strategic logic can rationalize almost anything. How the distance between defender and monster is measured not in intentions, but in what you're willing to sacrifice and who you're willing to sacrifice for victory. The Romanian archaeologists who excavated the mass graves near medieval Wallachian fortifications in the 1970s and 80s found what the chronicles described. Skeletal evidence of vertical impalement, personal belongings that identified some victims as women. Burial contexts that spoke of hasty interments after weeks of exposure. These weren't warriors, they were the collateral mathematics of terror. Vlad would eventually be released, would briefly regain his throne, would die in battle in 1476, killed, according to some accounts, by his own men who had tired of serving a prince whose methods haunted even those who fought beside him. The legend that grew around him would eclipse the history, would transform him into Dracula, would make him immortal in ways that have nothing to do with what actually happened on that winter road in 1462. But the women on the stakes, they weren't legend. They were daughters, wives, mothers, whose final moments served a strategic purpose in a war they likely never understood. Their bodies became messages written in the language of atrocity, delivered to an empire that thought it had seen everything warfare could offer. Mehmed II conquered Constantinople at age 21, crushed rebellions across 2 continents, died at 49, having expanded his empire to the gates of Vienna. But there's a detail in Tursunbeg's chronicle that lingers. After seeing that forest of stakes, the Sultan was never quite the same. Something in him had been marked by encountering a form of warfare that transcended what he thought possible. Because that's what Vlad understood, perhaps better than any of his contemporaries. There are things worse than death. And if you're willing to show them, to display them where your enemies must look, you can make even an empire blink. The mud along that road has frozen and thawed 600 times since that winter. The stakes are long gone, returned to the earth they were carved from. But the archives remain. The osteological reports remain. The scattered jewelry and broken domestic ceramics remain, marking the places where the logic of war consumed the lives that should have been outside its reach. And in those archives, in the careful handwriting of Venetian merchants and Saxon town clerks, in the bureaucratic Ottoman fiscal registers adjusting for unexpected losses, are the names. Not all of them medieval record-keeping, rarely bothered with complete tallies of women, but enough. Enough to remember that behind the strategic success, behind the Sultan's retreat and the 12-year imprisonment and the 5-century legend, were individual humans who died slowly on sharpened stakes because a prince decided their suffering was worth what it would purchase. The horror isn't that it happened. Medieval warfare was brutal across continents. The horror is how carefully it was planned, how consciously women were chosen for maximum psychological impact, how effectively terror worked as a weapon, and how easily the screams along that winter road became just another strategic calculation in the ledger books of princes and sultans who never had to hear them.